Hey, I'm David G, and I hope you all are doing great today. I was just wondering, have you ever been stuck in an airport somewhere unfamiliar and far from home? Or has an airline ever lost your bag and played hard to reach afterwards? This kind of stuff happens every single day of the year, every hour of the day to passengers. But the truth is, there are laws all around the world to help protect you in these kinds of situations, but most people don't even know about them. So recently, the US Department of Transportation finally set out some passenger-friendly rules that they will be setting in place soon. But in this video, we will not be talking about those new US rules or how a bunch of airlines are suing the government over them. So if you missed that news and want to know more, you can give my other video about that a watch after this one. But after hearing about the new passenger rights developments in the US, I got to thinking and realized that there aren't really any great resources online that go over all the different passenger rights around the world. And the thing is, we all want to travel all around the world, and knowing your rights when doing so is a must. So I thought I'd give you a rundown of some of the most useful passenger protection regulations around the world. We'll be going over rules that apply to passengers traveling in Europe, Australia, Latin America, Asia, and beyond. And one little known set of rules that I'll go over apply to almost every country, so don't miss that one. But since Europe gets about half of the world's tourist visits each year, let's start there. I mean, outside of the last set of rules we'll go over in this video, Europe's set of passenger protections will be useful to the most people. Oh yeah, and I really like the fact that the rules in Europe force airlines to pay you money when they mess up. And in Europe, the law of the land is known as EU 261, at least in European countries that are in the EU. While many rules around the world entitle you to basic help from the airline, refunds, and transportation alternatives, EU 261 gives you the right to all of those things in addition to cash compensation. For a flight to be EU 261 eligible, it has to be departing from or arriving to the EU and flown on an EU carrier, or flown on a non-EU carrier and departing from the EU. So a valid delayed flight departing from the EU and headed for the US on a non-EU airline is eligible for EU 261 compensation because it departs from the EU. But for a delayed flight departing from the US and headed to the EU to be eligible for EU 261 compensation, it would have to be flown on an EU carrier. So in this case, Lufthansa would have to pay up because they're a German airline and Germany is in the EU. But United Airlines would not have to pay up because they're based in the US. But there's more to it. A flight disruption can be the result of either a delayed flight, a cancelled flight, or being involuntarily denied boarding. But what's key is that your arrival to your destination must be delayed by at least 2 hours for all flights of less than 1,500 kilometers in distance, 3 hours for all flights within the EU of more than 1,500 kilometers, or any other covered flight with a distance of between 1,500 and 3,500 kilometers, or by 4 hours if the flight doesn't fall into any of the first two categories. And then the actual amount of compensation that you can receive is based on that same combination of distance flown and the amount of time delayed. So the actual amount of compensation you get is 250 euros for the first category, 400 euros for the second category, and 600 euros for the third category. EU 261 is usually pretty easy to claim yourself. And I usually just do a quick search online to find where to claim for the airline in question. But you can also just ask the airline directly for this information. Sometimes for non-EU airlines it can be a little bit more difficult to figure out the best way to contact them, but even then there's always a generic contact form or email address that you can use to make your claim. Now in the past it wasn't always so easy to figure out how to make your claim with the airline. And as a result, a bunch of different third-party websites that make your claim for you hit the market. But they do take a cut of your compensation that's often well over 30%. So I always start by trying to claim directly with the airline. But if your claim is denied by an airline and you don't think it should have been, then it might be worth giving one of those third-party websites a shot. EU 261 also gives you the right to food and drinks during a long delay, as well as a place to stay if you're delayed overnight. Plus, technically, EU 261 includes rules for what airlines have to do when they lose or delay you receiving your luggage. But we'll go over everything to do with luggage in the last part of this video. And just to make sure it's completely clear, the compensation that you're entitled to under EU 261 is in addition to any refund or transport that you receive. But really important to keep in mind, when there's an extraordinary circumstance causing your delay, EU 261 does not apply. These are usually things like weather, air traffic control, or something else that's just totally out of the control of the airline. But even when it seems like that's the case, it's always worth checking with the airline to verify the cause of the delay. Oh yeah, and the amount of time that you have to claim depends a lot on the EU country that you're dealing with. So while in Bulgaria and Poland you have only 1 year to claim, Malta puts absolutely no time limit on making a claim at all. But sooner is probably better than later when it comes to this kind of stuff. And a lot of people I talk to do recognize the name of EU 261, but don't necessarily realize if and when they're entitled to receive money. Now, EU 261 is not the only passenger protection regulation that dictates cash compensation in the world. So since your passenger rights in Europe are clear, let's head over to Canada and see what passenger rights look like there. Canada has strong passenger protections against flight disruption that are known under the very creative name of the Canadian Air Passenger Protection Regulations, or APPR for short. These rules cover flight disruption as well as lost or damaged baggage. And just like EU 261, they require the airlines to give you cash compensation in many cases. APPR has different compensation amounts depending on if the airline you're flying with is considered a small or large airline. Air Canada would be categorized as a large airline, while Porter is considered a small airline. If you're unsure about the size of your airline, it should be listed on any ticket sold for flights to, from, or within Canada. And then the compensation amount that large airlines have to pay is 400 Canadian dollars if the passenger arrives between 3 and 6 hours late, 700 Canadian dollars if the passenger arrives between 6 and 9 hours late, and 1,000 Canadian dollars if the passenger arrives 9 or more hours late. If you choose to get a refund instead of rebooking, large airlines still have to pay you 400 Canadian dollars. And then small airlines have to pay 125 Canadian dollars if the passenger arrives between 3 and 6 hours late, and 250 Canadian dollars if the passenger arrives between 6 and 9 hours late, and then 500 Canadian dollars if the passenger arrives 9 or more hours late. And again, if you were to choose a refund over rebooking, the small airline would still have to pay you 125 Canadian dollars. And by the way, if you're used to US dollars, keep in mind that I'm giving all the compensation amounts in Canadian dollars. But regardless, in Canada, you always have 1 year to make your compensation claim in writing. And then the airline always has 30 days to respond, either by just issuing payment or telling you why they believe you're not owed compensation. And if you can't get a response within 30 days or just don't agree with the response you get, the CTA or Canadian Transport Authority is easy to get in touch with. But in cases where the airline disrupts your flight for a safety reason, or the flight is disrupted for a reason outside of the airline's control, you cannot claim compensation. But even though you can't claim compensation in those cases, you still have the right to be rebooked or refunded. And additionally, if you already left your original departure airport, the airline is obligated to get you back in addition to giving you a refund. And another set of passenger protection regulations can be found just a bit south of Canada, down in the country of Mexico. Mexico's set of passenger rights are outlined in the Federal Civil Aviation Law. And these rights apply to flights operated by all Mexican airlines in addition to all foreign airlines operating flights to or from Mexico. So whether you're on a domestic flight within Mexico or an international flight operated by Iberia, United, or whatever non-Mexican airline, you're covered by these protections. This Mexican law outlines remedies for various scenarios and includes compensation, but it doesn't seem to dictate that compensation should be given in cash. So from what I can tell, most airlines are just giving out vouchers. Basically, compensation under this law depends on if the flight is domestic or international and how long the delay is. For domestic flights that are delayed between 2 and 4 hours, you'd be entitled to 25% of your ticket price. And then if that delay were over 4 hours, you'd be entitled to 50% of the ticket price. And for international flights, it's 7.5% of the ticket price for a delay of between 4 and 6 hours, or 12.5% for a delay of over 6 hours. Additionally, it dictates that if you're involuntarily denied boarding, you're entitled to some compensation too. It also dictates that for domestic flights with a delay of over 2 hours and international flights with a delay of over 4 hours, you're entitled to food and drinks. Plus, the pretty standard requirement for the airline to give accommodation if you're delayed overnight is also included in that law. I guess I've been pretty lucky that every single time I've flown with a Mexican airline, the flight has been right on time and everything went smoothly. But in case it's hard to get a response from the airline, you should be able to write to the Federal Consumer Protection Agency too. Again, I don't have any first-hand experience claiming compensation in Mexico, but it's really nice that they have these rules in place. And while they might not be as impressive as some of the others that we've looked at, I still find it useful to know that you can get something and be taken care of in case of a flight disruption in Mexico. And as someone from the US, I find it interesting that both of these neighboring countries to the US, Canada and Mexico, have stronger flight protections when it comes to legally requiring airlines to compensate passengers when they mess up. But let's head to a different part of the world and see what passenger protections look like in the world's biggest country by population. India is a rapidly growing aviation market that has its own set of passenger rights outlined in the Indian Civil Aviation Requirements, or CAR for short. Similar to all the other rules we've looked at, the CAR regulations apply to Indian airlines as well as foreign airlines operating flights to or from India. And the good news is that compensation is a part of the deal. But compensation is limited to canceled flights, being denied boarding due to overbooking and downgrades. In the case of a canceled flight, airlines only have to compensate passengers when the cancellation was announced less than 24 hours before departure. And the amount of compensation maxes out at only 10,000 rupees, which is a little more than $100 US. But since compensation is just based on your one-way fare and fuel charges, it can even be less. And then if you're downgraded to a lower cabin class but still decide to travel, you're entitled to a reimbursement of 75% of the ticket cost for domestic flights, and between 30 and 75% for international flights, depending on the distance flown. It looks like they did take some inspiration from EU 261 with the distances here. And just like all of the other flight delay compensation that we've looked at in this video, the airline does have to be at fault for the delay. CAR also details compensation in the case of overbooking. So if you're flying to, from, or within India and you're involuntarily denied boarding, unless the airline can get you on another flight that leaves within an hour of the original flight's departure time, you're owed some compensation. And beyond cash compensation, you're also entitled to food and drinks if your delay is over 2 hours, and the standard hotel accommodation if it ends up being an overnight delay. Plus, if you don't use your ticket, you can get a refund. But it is really worth pointing out that the current compensation rules in India were only clarified in 2023. And it seems like airlines are still kind of getting adjusted to them. In case you have any issues claiming compensation, then getting in touch with the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, or the DGCA for short, is easy via their app or on their website. If anyone has claimed compensation in India lately, definitely drop a comment and let us know how the process went for you. And keeping on towards the Southern Hemisphere, let's move to a different part of the world, one with kangaroos and koala bears. Over in Australia, passenger protection is currently drawn from Australian Consumer Law, or ACL for short. ACL applies to all flights to, from, and within Australia. And from what I can tell, it also includes flights that only connect in Australia. The big downside to this is that it doesn't specify exact compensation amounts. The ACL basically just guarantees your right to a refund or free rebooking if you have a delayed or canceled flight. And it feels kind of like how things are in the US, at least up until now, where the government just lets airlines decide how much compensation they feel like giving. But there is a commission in Australia that will hear you out if you're not happy with the compensation that you're given. But in the same way that the DOT has been working over in the US to get some more passenger-friendly rules in place, a new set of passenger-friendly rules has been proposed to the Australian Parliament. Though the exact compensation amounts aren't yet established as far as I can tell, I suspect that we'll see something similar to these compensation schemes that we've already looked at in this video. But even beyond all of the rules that we've gone over here so far, there's another set of rules that passengers are often completely unaware of, and they apply to a much wider group of passengers than any of the rules we've gone over so far. Back in 1999, the members of the International Civil Aviation Organization met in Montreal. And there they drafted up the unification of certain rules for international carriage by air, which is most often referred to as the Montreal Convention today. I guess people realize that was a lot to say, but the thing is, a lot of people don't know these rules exist. Maybe it's not as well known as it should be because the name sounds more like an event than a set of rules. I think I'll go to the Montreal Convention next summer since Miley Cyrus is playing there. Just kidding, but call it whatever you want to call it. These rules are applicable in 136 different countries, and that just so happens to include all of the large aviation markets in the world. A big focus of the convention was to improve global passenger rights and compensation in the case of airlines causing damage. So injuries or worse that happen to passengers while traveling with an airline. We all hope those kinds of things don't happen, and modern aviation is incredibly safe. But it's really good to know that these rules have got your back in most of the world. But the other thing that the Montreal Convention covers is something that happens pretty frequently when traveling in my experience. And no, unfortunately it's not that everybody should always have the right to a free upgrade to business class. This set of rules dictates compensation for lost and damaged luggage on most international flights operated around the world. But some of the other rules we've gone over here explicitly include baggage compensation too. Let's take a look at the details. If your luggage is lost by the airline, the Montreal Convention guarantees you up to 1,288 special drawing rights, which is a kind of international currency they use. Doesn't really matter what the currency is. That's equivalent to somewhere around 1,700 US dollars. And under the Montreal Convention, if your bag is delayed, you're entitled to reasonable expenses until your bag is recovered. Some airlines may publish limits, but honestly, the approach I've always taken here is to just buy what I need that's stuck in my delayed bag. And then if the airline damages your luggage, you can also get compensation for that under the Montreal Convention. Damaged baggage does have to be reported within 7 days though. And delayed and lost baggage must be reported within 21 days to the airline. For all of this, you generally just need to provide evidence and then the airline is required to compensate you. I've never had any issues, and one time I even received compensation before submitting my evidence. But if an airline were not really cooperating, there are plenty of legal experts that deal with baggage rights under the Montreal Convention. And if you're watching this and need some specific legal advice, know that I'm just an expert traveler that's been dealing with this stuff for plenty of years. I can't help you with any legal advice. Again, I've never had any issues after a fair amount of claims. But let's see how the Montreal Convention compares to other rules that guarantee you compensation for baggage issues. India, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and all of the EU guarantee the Montreal Convention amounts for international flights. And Canada's policy for domestic baggage compensation is basically the exact same thing as you're guaranteed on international flights under the Montreal Convention. But in both Australia and Mexico, domestic flights are only subject to the rules set out by the airlines, meaning they might or might not meet the Montreal Convention standards depending on the airline and even the fare class that you've booked. And then in India, you're guaranteed 20,000 rupees by law for baggage compensation on domestic flights, which is only a little over $300 US. And it's worth noting that in the US, checked bags on a domestic flight have a maximum liability of $3,800 US, which is significantly more than you'd be guaranteed under the Montreal Convention. So it's great to know that your baggage is covered here. But as a frequent traveler, I'd really advise you to keep anything essential in a carry-on bag. I personally travel with a 40-liter Osprey backpack that can be a full-size carry-on on most airlines, and I've left a link in the description if you're interested in checking that bag out. Most of the time, especially when I have a non-stop flight, I just try to avoid checking a bag at all. But if there's layovers to deal with and the checked bag is included, I often find it more convenient to let the airline haul it from plane to plane for me instead of me doing it myself in the airport. Though before I had this really functional Osprey bag, I did find it a little bit more of a hassle to get around the airport with a full-size carry-on. Anyways, computers, cash, jewelry, all that stuff you just can't lose, that goes in your carry-on bag always. And regardless of where you're flying and which rules cover you, documentation is always key. If you need to claim compensation, you always want to have the basic information about your ticket available. Luckily, documentation has become pretty easy these days because you always just get an email confirmation with your reservation code and your ticket number. Just make sure not to ever delete it. And many airlines even let you manage everything in an app too now. But the proficiency of airline apps really varies a whole lot around the world. Anytime you don't have something digitalized, make sure to document it in case things don't go quite as planned. Now, there are many more passenger protection regulations around the world, and I just find the 6 that we just went over to be the most interesting and useful to know about. But if you know of another set of rules that you feel benefit passengers around the world, feel free to share them in the comments. And in case you want to take a further look at any of these rules on your own, I've left a link to each of them in the description. So if you found this video helpful or even just interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with other travelers that could find value in it too. So stay tuned and do subscribe for many more travel videos. Thanks so much for watching.